Greetings from Hopalong Hollow and part 3 of Edwardian Christmas. Today we're going to have a very British theme in our Edwardian Christmas because we're going to follow a few traditions and customs that are very familiar with the English, but not so much with we Americans. So we're going to start out with a very British recipe, but before that, let's do something very English and pour a cup of tea. This is Royal Blend from Fortnum & Mason. We're pouring into a transferware cup called Shakespeare Land, made in England. And then we're going to start a really easy and fun craft project. Now in this episode of Edwardian Christmas, we're going to be doing two traditions that are very British indeed. And our cooking recipe is going to be for a Christmas pudding, or what we basically know of as a plum pudding. Now, as for myself and many Americans, we did not grow up eating plum pudding, or what is known as Christmas pudding. In fact, we wonder why it's called a pudding at all, because it's actually more of a cake. But apparently, that is what most Brits call their desserts, is pudding. And what we call pudding, they call custard. But this is actually, to me, kind of like a really nice, dense fruit cake. And this is going to be only the second time in my life that I have made one of these. The first time I made a Christmas pudding was back in home ec class, back when I was in school. And we had this wonderful home economics teacher. And one year we did an entire Christmas feast. We did a roasted goose. We made a plum pudding, actually using suet. I'm not using suet in my recipe. We did marzipan, and we just had all kinds of traditional British food. Now, I honestly don't know why, in all my years of cooking, that I have never made, other than in a home ec class, a plum pudding, because to me it's very much like fruit cake, and I absolutely love fruit cake, which I have made before. I also feel pretty comfortable doing this because, well, although I'm not British, I do have, on my mother's side, an English heritage, and on my father's side, an English and a Dutch heritage. So I'm actually very fond of many, many British and English things. We have an image of Bob Cratchit's wife serving a flaming Christmas pudding to her family in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. But Christmas pudding is much older in the time of Dickens. Now this is a fairly easy cake to make, I should say pudding. Let's use the proper lingo here. It might have been it's still an expensive recipe to make because you do have to get a lot of dried fruit. And back in the day, I'm not quite sure how accessible these things might have been, but since Christmas pudding was so popular and almost a must-have at a Christmas feast, even Bob Cratchit's Christmas feast, these items would probably be quite easy to get. And for the Edwardians, very, very easy. Surprisingly, I could not find a plum pudding or a Christmas pudding, although I found a lot of other wonderful desserts in this Edwardian cookbook. This is the unofficial Downton Abbey cookbook. A lot of great recipes in here, but no plum pudding. I also didn't find one in my Mary Frances cookbook or any of my other old cookbooks. So instead, I got a recipe online from the Queen, called the Queen's Christmas Pudding, and it is off of Food Network, and it's from Chef John. And I just tweaked it a little bit, but I really love the ingredients that he is using in his plum pudding, and he's using very, very little sugar and very few spices. I'm going to start out by chopping up these dates, and there are 15 dates here. That's exactly how many were in the package, and that's exactly how many this recipe called for. Now, one thing he recommends is that you oil your very sharp knife, or butter it up, so that when you're cutting these dates, they don't completely stick to the knife. Now, what eventually evolved into plum pudding began long before medieval times, and it was really more of a fermented porridge. And rather than a lot of fruit in it, it actually had a lot of meat in it, whether it was chicken, whether it was poultry, fish, or beef. It started out as a fermented soup, more or less. Now along came the Tudors, and they began to add less meat, although suet was still used, which is from beef, And a lot more fruit was added and a lot more dry ingredients, turning it into more of a firm, as we would call cake-like object. The Tudors also introduced the addition of alcohol into the pudding. And because of all this dried fruit, it was very, very rich, very, very sweet. Then along came the Puritans, and they banned this Christmas pudding. They banned it, number one, for the alcohol involved, and also because of its richness. And they thought it was a very decadent dessert. Chopping these to about this size. There's a nice bite full here, but you don't want them too big and you don't want them too small. You could do it in a food processor, but that could possibly puree some of it, and you don't want to do that to your dates, aside from the fact that the Edwardians would not have had a food processor. Although electricity had been introduced by this period. Most Edwardians didn't have electricity in their home at that point. In fact, they were very distrustful of it. In fact, gas lighting had just been around for about 10 years before electricity was introduced into the home. And the Edwardians weren't quite sure about it. They were very distrustful of it. Also, the telephone. You need a great big bowl, close at hand, to drop all your fruit in. Now we're going to chop up the apricots to get about 1.5 cups of chopped apricots. These are not quite as sticky as the dates. A lot easier to chop. Oh, I love these. Aren't they pretty? They're like jewels. Adding our apricots, 1.5 cup of chopped apricots, 1/4 cup of currants, they're just tiny, tiny raisins, and 1/2 cup, or I'm sorry, 1/3 cup of golden raisins, 1 cup of dried cranberries. The one item I could not find was the crystallized ginger, but a substitute could be just a regular piece of ginger chopped up, but they say that it's not really sweet enough to replace the crystallized. So another substitute would be powdered ginger. So I used 2 teaspoons of powdered ginger with 2 teaspoons of sugar, and then you add a little bit of water. So you get that rich ginger flavor. Now you're going to need the zest of 1 large orange, and in this case, or tangerine, or in this case I'm using clementines. And you want to get that juice in there too. I bought the clementines because they just happen to be sweeter than the oranges. We're also going to want some roughly cut, chopped pecans, walnuts, or almonds. I added my orange zest to my ginger mixture, and I'm going to put that in. And also, the recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of whiskey or brandy, but I'm replacing the liquor with 3 tablespoons of prune juice. And you mix this beautiful thing all together now. And some people say to let it sit for quite some time and let the fruit absorb all that liquor or liquid, whatever liquid you're using. 18th and 19th century, this was actually enjoyed throughout the year. But in the early 20th century, the Edwardian period, which we're talking about right now, this was became more of a Christmas dessert and pretty much ignored throughout the rest of the year. From what I understand, it's not nearly as popular as it once was. But I think that if this turns out very well, this is going to become a yearly tradition in our house. Next, I am adding 10 tablespoons of melted butter. Now, normally in an original recipe, they would be using suet. I have not got access to suet, and frankly, it doesn't sound very good to me. But I do love butter. And then we're going to add in 1 beaten egg. Just 1 beaten egg. And we're going to coat this, stir it until it's well coated. There are certain traditions that go along with this pudding. One of them is that you should always stir the pudding from east to west in honor of the 3 wise men. That you should always put holly atop the plum pudding when it's finished to represent Christ's crown of thorns, and that your pudding should have 13 ingredients. Well, I didn't count the ingredients on this one, and I don't understand that. If anybody knows about the 13 ingredients, please let us know. Next, we're going to add a 1/2 cup of heavy cream. Ooh, this is what I would like to have in my coffee. But I usually use 1/2 and 1/2 because it's not quite so fattening and it's a lot cheaper. We're also going to put in 3/4 cup of buttermilk. You can use regular milk, but the author of this recipe says that he likes a little bit of that tartness of the buttermilk. Now I'm going to make this into buttermilk with 3/4 cup. This is a cup measurement, so I'm not going all the way to the top. And then about a teaspoon of lemon juice. And that will turn that into a good substitute for the buttermilk. Okay, I've mixed in the buttermilk, and I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of kosher salt. Then I'm going to add in 1/2 cup of dry breadcrumbs. Now, in original recipes would call probably for fresh breadcrumbs, but I actually prefer to use these because it's just easier. Now we're going to be adding our all-purpose flour, 1.5 cups. And then we're going to be adding our nuts, our chopped nuts. And our chopped nuts were 1 1/4 cup of chopped pecans or walnuts, or the nut of your choice. This is going to give us a nice stiff dough. At least that's what they tell me. Seems to be coming along really well. Now in this dough, it was traditional to throw something in here. And what I mean is charms, certain kinds of charms. It was a tradition to put certain things in the dough. And then whoever cut open their piece of plum pudding and they got that little item, it meant something. It was meant to be either good luck, such as a coin, often a coin. It could also be a wishbone, which was meant to bring good luck, or a boot, probably a little boot trinket, which was meant that you were going to travel. A thimble, which wasn't so good if you were a single lady. It meant you would be a spinster for at least another year. And a little bell, which would mean good luck. Apparently you can still purchase these little items today to add to your plum pudding, but we're not going to put anything in this year's plum pudding because I'm just testing this out. And if I like it next year, maybe I will just go ahead and put, I don't know about that wishbone. That sounds a little bit dangerous to me. But the thimble, the boot, and the bell, that might be okay. So we're going to stir this thoroughly so we have a nice stiff batter, and I do, very nice and stiff. And then I'm going to heavily grease my containers that I'm going to be cooking this in. I'm not really cooking it, you're steaming it. This is not something you cook in the oven. This is a pudding that you steam. Now, there are a few ways that you can do this. You can use an actual pudding mold, and that's what this is. This is an old pudding mold with a really nice tight-fitting lid. It locks on really well, and this is my first choice. What I like about this is I like the shape. I also like the fact that it's got the hole in the middle I also like the fact that this is actually an antique. And so it's going to have a nice pattern for the plum pudding. As you can see, the mold shape. This is, looks a little strange inside, but believe me, it's as clean as a whistle. So this is my first choice, and I'm going to grease this up really well so that the pudding will be removed easily. But as I said, I have so much dough here, I might have enough to make 2 Christmas puddings. So this is an ironstone, an antique ironstone mold, and this one does not have a lid, but there is a way to protect it because you're going to be steaming this in a pot of water for 4 hours, and you don't want the water to get into the pudding. I'm going to begin spooning my mixture into my mold. Well, I'm actually really surprised. I think this small pudding pan is going to contain the entire batch. This went all the way up to the top. I smoothed the top of it with a spatula. I also have oiled the lid because I don't want this sticking to the lid when I try to remove the pudding. And then I'm going to lock it up. And I'm going to let this sit in the refrigerator overnight, or you can let it sit 8 hours. They say that's a good thing to do, so we will do it. And we'll be back in the morning to put this on the stove. I allowed the pudding to sit overnight, and now I'm going to put it in a pot of steaming water. Now we're going to leave it steaming for 4 hours. And this pot has got such really secure little latches on it that it should keep all the water out, but you want to keep the water level beneath the lid nevertheless. So I've got a pot of water over here steaming already. Me too. Oh, I mentioned earlier that the tradition was to have 13 ingredients in your pudding, and then I found out that that was because the 13 ingredients represented the 12 apostles and Jesus. Also, they would begin to make this pudding 5 weeks before Christmas at the beginning of Advent. And each member of the family, they would have something called stirring day or stirring Sunday, where each member of the family or people would come over and stir the pudding for good luck. So that's another tradition that has continued on with figgy pudding, plum pudding, Christmas pudding. I don't know if you can see it because of the steam, but down in the bottom of the pot, I've put a cookie cutter and a couple sprigs of rosemary just for the scent to fill the house. You want to set your pudding pot on top of that cookie cutter so that it's not sitting on the bottom. You want some circulation going all the way around your pudding bowl. I'm going to set it right on top. So here we are, steaming away. We'll put a lid on. We'll continue to check this every hour, and hopefully in about 4 hours we will have a plum pudding ready to go. She is in all her glory. I had quite some time coaxing it out of the mold, and I learned a very serious lesson. You really got to butter up that mold because my poor pudding fell apart right here, and I had to coax that piece out of the mold and put it back together again. So now I have a cracked figgy pudding. Oh, well, I don't care. It's okay. It still looks fairly good. Maybe I can hide that. Anyway, really butter up that mold really well. I will do that the next time. So this figgy pudding, plum pudding, Christmas pudding, will keep for a very long time. And we're not even going to have it until Christmas, or maybe even New Year's. But that's the whole thing. It's said that the older they are, the better they get, and they can keep for quite some time. So I'll probably wrap this up and put it away, and then when we serve it on Christmas, we will put some holly and some holly berries on the top and make it look very beautiful. So, better luck next time. Next year, it will be much better than this. But for my first try, I think it was okay. Most of my viewers on this channel are Americans, so I ask you to tell me the truth. Have you ever been watching a British production, a movie or a program like Hercule Poirot? And they're sitting around the Christmas table, and they're all wearing these ill-fitting, weird little tissue paper, colorful hats. Everyone, from the children to the 80-year-olds, Even Hercule Poirot is guilty of putting on one of those little hats in one of the episodes. And then they grab one of these strange little cylinder wrapped packages. Two people grab either end of the package, they pull them apart, and snap, pop goes the weasel, and there's fireworks at the table. At the dinner table. Have you ever wondered, what is that all about? And as a Christmas tradition, how come we Americans don't have that? Because that looks like a lot of fun. Well, I didn't grow up with that tradition, but we can thank somebody named Tom Smith for the Christmas cracker. Well, I think we can be pretty certain that the Edwardians, at least in Britain, and probably Australia as well, did have that tradition. The tradition of the Christmas cracker, invented by a confectioner, Tom Smith, over 150 years ago, and still going strong to this day. So let's talk a little bit about the Christmas cracker, because it really actually has a really interesting history. So I will be referring to this book by Peter Kimpton throughout this presentation, and I'm not going to go into a great bunch of detail, but I do want to tell you a little bit about how the Christmas cracker came to be. And actually, Tom Smith was a confectioner in London, but he also sold wedding goods and fancy ornaments and bunting and all sorts of wedding cake decorations and that sort of thing. Now, it's likely that Tom Smith went to a trade show in Paris and saw the bonbon. Now, the bonbon was most likely a sugar-coated almond or a chocolate-covered almond. It was wrapped in wax or tissue paper, twisted at the ends, and sold as bonbonnière or bonbonnier, also known as bonbons. So Tom Smith came home with this idea to London and was probably the first confectioner in London to actually sell bonbons. And he did a real bang-up business around Christmas time. But after Christmas time, business slacked off and the bonbons just weren't doing so well. So he wanted to come up with an idea to sell the bonbons for all occasions all year long. And he thought that by adding a little motto or a rhyme and slipping it inside the bonbon package, this would make them a lot more successful. And he was right. It really did work. He was able to sell these much more exclusively all year long. He was right about the success of the bonbon. And the year was around 1840. And in the next decade, he began to develop the idea of crackers, something a little bit bigger, maybe something with a little more pizzazz to it. And up came the idea of developing the cracker. Mr. Smith spent the next several years trying to really develop the idea of this cracker, something that would be really different and really special. And the first crackers were really quite small. They were about 6 inches, and they did not have the cracking sound. In fact, they weren't even called crackers at that time. At this point, these were still called bonbons. The traditional story says that he was sitting one night by his fire, he threw another log on the fire, it began to spit and crack and pop. And suddenly he had the idea of putting a bang into the makeup of his bonbons. But how to do it was the question. Now, by the 1860s, he was finally able, after much experimentation, he was able to produce something that actually did make a snap or a pop. And he called them bangs of expectation. Now, obviously, the bonbon had to be made a lot bigger. And so, like I said, the original crackers were about 6 inches long. Of course, crackers now come in all sorts of different sizes. Now, at the time, in the Victorian days, they weren't really sticklers on safety. And so it's said that some of those crackers actually caught on fire. Maybe not his brand, but they were other people copying him. And sometimes one of those crackers could actually start a fire if they were made by the wrong company. So in those early days, it was something called saltpeter. That was the chemical that was used to produce the little mini explosion. Now, the snapping sound that comes out of today's crackers is a chemical called silver formulate. And because of safety restrictions, it can be no more than 1.6 milligrams per unit. So these are very, very safe. Now this new creation by Tom Smith just took off, if you'll excuse the pun, like a shot, because people loved these crackers, and I am amazed when I look through the book. Wait till I show you the absolute limits that they went to create these crackers. Obviously, the word crackers came from the crack and the snapping sound, but that wasn't all. Inside those little boxes of confectionery was not only a little chocolate treat or a piece of candy, there were also tiny little novelties, and there were also poems or very bad jokes. And then came the paper crowns. Now, I haven't gotten so far as to tell you about the paper crowns yet, because I haven't read this whole book, but I certainly will look into it and we'll talk about it next year. Now, not only were novelties and candies put inside the little tube inside the crackers, but also very bad jokes, and here are some examples of the very bad jokes, which I will read to you, mottos, and also sweet poems. Love poems. Here are a few examples of the really bad jokes. What must you know to be an auctioneer? Lots. When is a Christmas pudding musical? When it's piping hot. Why, how do you keep sheep warm in winter? By central bleating. Well, you get the picture. Pretty bad jokes. Why do rabbits like beer, or why do rabbits make beer? I think they start with the hops. So these are pretty bad jokes. But what I really want you to see are all the fabulous designs that these crackers came in. Now, as I mentioned before, they started out pretty simple. Brown paper, maybe with a ribbon on the end. But as time went on, they got more and more elaborate. Not only the crackers themselves, but the boxes that they came in. If you were a collector and you were able to find some of these wonderful graphics, what a collection that would be. Here you see some of the cracker boxes. Look at this one here, World War I themed. They often had different types of themes. Here's the Christmas theme. These are extremely ornate because they were also used to decorate your table. Tom Smith's artistic crackers for table decoration. So when you make these crackers, you can really use your imagination, kind of like what we did with the scrap ornaments. You can make them very simple, or you can make them as a very Edwardian or Victorian type of ornament for your table. I think I already mentioned this, but they also would use a lot of scrap, and we used scrap in our last video to make the scrap ornaments. And you can see some of the scrap used on some of these crackers right here. Crepe paper, tissue paper. Okay, here we have some of the crowns. The crowns and the hats were a lot more interesting than the ones they create nowadays. But I just think this is, I had no idea that these were so interesting, that they had such an interesting history. And that's why I think it would be a lot of fun to have this as a tradition. These are not just for Christmas. They are for parties and birthdays and all sorts of special occasions. Now, crackers are still made today, and you can still buy them completely ready to go. I don't think I've seen any quite as beautiful as this. You could make some like this, though. But I'm just going to show you how to make a very simple cracker. And we're going to be using brown paper and wrapping paper. The things you're going to need, first of all, of course, are paper. You could use plain brown paper, and you could use any kind of wrapping paper or decorative papers. Try to make sure they're a little bit lightweight because these crackers have to pull apart. A ruler, a pencil, an X-Acto knife, a pair of scissors, some glue, some tape, some decor like ribbons and berries and strings. I've taken paper towel rolls and cut them into 4-inch lengths, but you could also use tissue paper rolls. And these are a little longer than 4 inches, so you have to measure your paper accordingly. I've gone ahead and cut my paper 12 inches by 8 inch. in order to accommodate a 4-inch center roll. Now I'm going to go along here and I'm going to just take a few measurements. I'm going to go 4 inches in the middle. Take 4 inches in the middle here, and then 1 inch beyond that is going to be a folding line. So inches here. So 3 inches to 4 inches, then go over to 8 inches, and then go over to 9 inches. So do that on either side, and then connect your lines. You might have to weight down your paper like I did, because it has a tendency to curl all over the place. So connect your lines. All right. Now, I'm going to fold the paper on the outer line on each side. Now, if you want to be really concise, you can measure what you're going to do next, but you don't have to, because it's not really going to show. But we're going to cut little darts all along the edge here with our scissors. I could place a little dot on the upper line every inch, just as sort of a guide to follow. But purpose for these darts is just so the cracker can break apart more easily, like so. Now, of course, the most important ingredient in your Christmas crackers is the snap. And this is what makes the cracking sound. So you want to take your snap and you want to put it right down the middle on the inside here. I put a little bit of glue on either side just to hold it in place as we put the rest of it together. We just don't want it shifting around as we move. You can purchase these. I got these off Etsy, but you can also get them off of Amazon. They're actually pretty easy to find. I've applied a little bit of glue right here. You could use tape just as easily. And we're going to center our roll right here. Let's start rolling it inward. There we go. Now you can either use a little bit of tape here, or you can also use the glue. Since I've got it on my fingers, I'll just use the glue. And now you can see how easily these will tie together. Now you can see why we've made the darts, and we're going to very carefully take a little string of ribbon. I'm going to tie one end very gently. So here you've got this tied on one end, and you've got an open end in which to insert your goodies. So you'll want to put your little paper crown in here, which is all folded up. Maybe a little token. I'm going to put in one of these little Dresden rabbits, some chocolates, some caramels, and of course a very bad joke or a nice little poem, love poem. So then tie up this end, and this cracker is ready for the party. Now, I didn't go very ornate or complicated with these crackers because I honestly didn't have a whole lot of time to do it. But to be honest with you, I prefer the brown paper crackers decorated in a more natural way. And I think this would be a fun thing to do with your family and a new tradition to try out. Now, as I said, these crackers are still popular to this day, and they were very, very much going strong in the Edwardian times. In fact, I'm going to link you to a video that shows a cracker factory in 1910 where they're actually making the Christmas crackers. But what do you think about this when they're pulling apart some kind of a little elf is jumping out of the Christmas cracker? But these were a lot of fun. I really wish that I had done all the videos that I wanted to for this season, but time got away from me. I had a lot of orders to fill for needle felting, but we will have at least one more before Christmas. So I hope you will join me then. And some of the things I wanted to do, like I said, I just couldn't get to it. So they'll have to wait till next year. So from Hopalong Hollow, I hope to see you Christmas Eve. And until then, bye-bye.